So tonight what I want to do is talk with you about the entwined stories of one of the greatest migration events in human history, the peopling of the Americas, as well as the evolving story of the history of anthropological thought about this major migration event. Really one of the just most amazing things that ever happened, including some of the contributions to this issue that the research I've done in Wisconsin makes, and ways in which it augments some of the things that we know about the ways in which people settled the Americas and what their lives were like. The issue of the peopling of the Americas has been a subject of considerable speculation, debate, and research interest since Europeans first came into the Americas. So there's a long history of different ideas and different ways of thinking about how the first peoples came into the Americas. And for a long time, the thought, the sort of conventional wisdom among people in general in the Americas and in Europe was that the native peoples who were living here when Europeans first came into the Americas had only been here for maybe a few hundred years before Europeans arrived. And so in the late 1800s, early 1900s, as people scholars in North America began to try and compete with European scholars on having Paleolithic people, the debate became one that was really pretty contested and pretty hot. And the question was framed as, were people in the Americas at the same time as the megafauna that went extinct at the end of the Pleistocene? Because this would be a way to confirm great antiquity. If you could find evidence of human activity in association with animals that had been extinct for 10,000 years. So the question got framed around this. This is how the question became framed. With this particular issue, so we're talking about, over 100 years ago, 120 some years ago, the research, the scholarly research, was centered in institutions in the East, particularly Harvard. And a man named Alice Hrdlicka was one of the kind of leading scholars on ancient peoples of the world. And he was firmly convinced that at the time there wasn't great control over time-death. He felt that Homo habilis, an early hominin ancestor, pre-modern human, was associated with the Pleistocene. And it is, it's just not the Pleistocene of 10,000 years ago, it's the Pleistocene much, much further back in time. And so he thought that if there were people in the Americas at the end of the Pleistocene, they would look like Homo habilis. They would not look like anatomically modern humans. And all of the skeletal material, which wasn't a lot, but all the skeletal material that had been excavated and examined from the Americas up to that point in time looked like anatomically modern humans. And so that, to him, was solid evidence that people had not been in the Americas since the Pleistocene. But as a scientist, he also outlined how you might investigate this question. And so he laid out an expectation of finding evidence of human tools or humans themselves in association with extinct species of animals in order to demonstrate unequivocally a Pleistocene presence of people in the Americas. So our story now, I'm going to shift well out of the Midwest in Wisconsin to a town in northeastern New Mexico called Folsom. And something happened in New Mexico in the 1920s that utterly transformed our understanding of the peopling of the Americas as well as the antiquity of humans in the Americas. And it's a really it's an interesting story for a variety of different reasons. But it starts on an August day, a late August day in 1908. I think it was actually the exact same day as in 2018. There was massive rain that led to flooding in Madison. So it's just kind of this sort of, odd juxtaposition 110 years later. But a freak thunderstorm arose over Johnson Mesa and unleashed 15 inches of rain in a really short period of time. And it led to considerable flooding, destruction of property, loss of life, just really had an incredible impact. And it's something that we continue, the impacts of floods are things that we continue to deal with today. But after the floodwaters had receded, an African-American cowboy named George McJunkin went riding across the ranch in New Mexico where he worked to check on cattle that might have been stranded but were still alive. And as he was riding across the ranch, he noticed that an arroyo that is called Wild Horse Arroyo had become much more deeply cut than it had been previously, and there were some cattle that were stranded in the arroyo. And so he went down to try and rescue them, to see if he could pull them out. And he happened to notice some massive bones eroding out of the side of the arroyo that had been exposed by the floodwaters. Now, George McJunkin was a self-trained natural history buff, and he was really interested in human skeletons, animal skeletons, fossils, all different kinds of things. And when he saw these large bones, he knew that they were not the same as the bones of cattle or horses or any of the large animals that he worked with on the ranch. They were bigger. They were something different. And so he shared this story of these finds with some of his friends. And they were interested, they were curious, but it's the 1920s, they're cowboys, they have tons of work to do, they're not getting out and about a whole lot. And so George McJunkin passed away in 1922, a few years before professional paleontologists were able to come and take a close look at this site in Wild Horse Arroyo. They arrived in the late 1920s, and in their second or third season of fieldwork at this site outside of Folsom, the paleontologists from the Colorado State Museum were excavating the remains of an extinct species of bison, Bison antiguus. And they've been excavating these remains for a couple of years, but in 1927 they found a spear point that was in the midst of the rib cage of this extinct species of bison. And they were knowledgeable enough about the debates that were raging in Eastern universities regarding the Pleistocene peopling of the Americas, that they recognized this was a really significant find. They also had the foresight to leave everything in place and ask Alice Hrdlicka and other archaeologists as well as paleontologists to come and see the find in situ, as we would call it. And so these guys got on, trains, they got into wagons, they made their way to New Mexico. It took, at least a week for them all to converge and arrive. And then they looked. It was such an unequivocal find that it swept away scholarly skepticism about the Pleistocene peopling of the Americas. And so this find really kind of shattered a long-standing paradigm or way of thinking. And it opened up new ways of thinking about the paleontological as well as archaeological record. And it led to some additional finds, including in the early 1930s, some excavations outside the town of Clovis, New Mexico, which was about 3 hours south of Folsom, at a site that we call Blackwater Draw. There, paleontologists were working on the excavation of mammoth remains. And that's actually, you can see that that's what Blackwater Draw is known for, is these extinct species of elephants. Well, in the process of their excavations in I think 1933, they found a spear point, another chipped stone tool in association with the bones of the mammoth. It looked different than the one that had been found at Folsom. And so archaeologists who are about as uncreative as you can get when it comes to naming things, named the style of point that had been found at Folsom, the Folsom Point, and named the style of point found at near Clovis, Clovis. Subsequent excavations at Blackwater Draw in particular actually revealed a temporal separation between Clovis and Folsom. It was some years later before they did this excavation, but here is a stratigraphic layer that was associated with the mammoths and the Clovis finds, the Clovis points. And then above it, at where this little hammer is the layer where Folsom points were found. So here they were able to demonstrate that that Clovis was an older style and Folsom was a newer style. There was some temporal separation between them. Radiocarbon dates, modern radiocarbon dates, have pushed the dates for Clovis back to about 13,250 years ago, roughly speaking, which is, that's well into the Pleistocene, which ended about 10,000 years ago. Now, at this time, widespread acceptance that people have been in the Americas since the end of the Pleistocene, but the idea in everyone's minds was that Clovis was represented the first people. This was the oldest, distinctive, readily identifiable kind of stone tool that had been found. It was initially found in the 1930s, and until the late 1990s, archaeologists were persuaded that this represented the very first people to come into the Americas, and they had migrated from Siberia across the Bering Strait, which was exposed as a land bridge when glaciers covered much of North America. And then an ice-free corridor emerged on the eastern side of the Rocky Mountains. It was opened somewhere between 13,500 years ago and 14,000 years ago. So this is open, and then, 250 years later, there are Clovis points all over North America, mostly concentrated, interestingly enough, in the eastern U.S. So this Clovis model, really, it was a long-standing model, widely accepted by a lot of people. And then in 1997, a publication came out about a site at the southern tip of Chile called Monte Verde. And Monte Verde, the site was a bog, and so it had remarkable preservation of things like twine and sticks, and even leaves, coca leaves that people had chewed and spit out were preserved. It was really remarkable. And these are exactly the kinds of materials that archaeologists need to get relatively good dates. And the dates for Monte Verde were 14,600 years ago. They had dozens of dates, and they all converged on this point. Older than Clovis. Now, how in the world did people get all the way down to the southern tip of Chile before they were all over eastern North America? And this site was just as contested as Folsom was. And the archaeologists who did the work at Monte Verde did the same thing that the paleontologists at Folsom did, was he contacted all of the leading archaeologists working on peopling of the Americas and had them fly down to Chile and come and see the site in person for themselves to help gain widespread scholarly acceptance. Well, in the years since 1997, archaeologists have revisited some dates, old dates on other Paleo-Indian sites that they were skeptical about, and they've gone back to sites where they stopped excavating when they hit the Clovis layer, and they began to excavate beneath the Clovis layer. And now we've got multiple sites spread across North America that have yielded dates that are in the range of 13,400 years ago to 15,500 years ago. So even dates that are a little bit older than Monte Verde. And they're spread across North America. So, and even there are a few in Alaska, which we would expect. But this created some challenges for how we think about the peopling of the Americas, because that ice-free corridor was not open 15,500 years ago. So how did people get into the Americas if they didn't come through the ice-free corridor? And there have been some wild and radical ideas that have been suggested, including the idea of something that's called the Kelp Highway, that people came by boat, by kayak, canoe, boat, along the western coast. And that's the idea that is seeming to gain the greatest amount of support right now. It's difficult to get empirical evidence because ocean levels were lower at the time of this island or this coastal migration. And so now that ocean levels are higher, some of those archaeological sites are underwater. And that's the case for sites. The Page Ladson site is today underwater off the coast of Florida. But the archaeological materials are still intact and available for archaeologists, underwater archaeologists, to look at. So now we've got this sort of thing like, okay, so people came via the coast. They had watercraft. That's really interesting and intriguing. But what about the ice-free corridor? No one wanted to give up on the ice-free corridor. And quite recently, just in the last couple of months, some ancient DNA work has been published that suggests there were actually probably 3 waves of migration, 1 or 2 of which were coastal, and 1 of which was via the ice-free corridor. And it's probably that somewhat later migration via the ice-free corridor that involved the people who innovated the Clovis technology. And that Clovis technology was shared widely with other people. It spread rapidly, and it spread rapidly through sharing as well as through the movement of people. So we now have this idea that there were several different waves and maybe several different paths by which people came into the Americas at the end of the Pleistocene. So a lot of sites have been excavated, and they've been excavated across North America and in South America that represent these first peoples that archaeologists call Paleo-Indian. We don't know what these people called themselves, and they may have had a range of different names for themselves. We rely a lot on foraging theory and ethnographic studies of hunter-gatherer populations that live in extreme environments like the Arctic or desert environments to try and build models of what we think the lifeways of Paleo-Indians might have been like. And for a long time, and it still is actually a pretty strongly entrenched idea, is that Paleo-Indians were primarily the hunters of big game, like mammoth, mastodon, bison, giant beaver, giant ground sloth, big animals. That's what they focused on. And certainly the earliest Paleo-Indian sites excavated in the Southwest were these kill butchery sites of megafauna. In fact, when you find these sites, the bones of these animals are huge. These things can be hard to miss once you stumble upon them. And so they were the focus of a lot of early excavation. But more recently, we've been, most of these megafauna excavation sites have been in the western half of the United States. Very few have been excavated in the eastern United States. There's one in southern Michigan. I can't remember if it's I think it's a mammoth site. There's the Boaz mastodon that was in Richland County, if I remember correctly. It's very close by. I know that. You should all know that site. And then there's several sites, and there's several sites in the southeastern part of the state, in Kenosha County, where both mammoth and mastodon have been excavated. The Boaz mastodon was purportedly found with a Clovis point, and the sites in southeastern Wisconsin have been found with flakes of stone and undiagnostic chipstone bifaces. This would be like spear points or knives They're not Clovis, they're not fulsome, they don't have any kind of distinctive appearance to them. Now, all of these kill butchery sites that have been excavated show that there's a range of different approaches that people took to hunting, from hunting herds to hunting single animals to sort of tracking animals to stampede, and stampede off cliffs is one of the sort of more dramatic ones, into a gorge where they would crush each other. And it's possible that some of these sites that have been excavated were scavenging of animals who were already dead. But some, the stampede ones are pretty hard to envision that something else was going on other than humans forcing the animals into a gorge. In the eastern United States, far fewer of these kill butchery sites have been found, but Paleo-Indian sites have been excavated. And in the eastern US, they show a range of different kinds of foods that people ate, from giant tortoise to waterfowl to even some plants and grasses. So the eastern United States sort of complements the knowledge that we have from the western United States to help us understand that the foodways of these ancient people were actually quite diverse. They weren't solely hunters, they were also gathering plant foods. But the plant foods, the evidence for the plant foods doesn't survive very well. And most of our inferences about that are drawn from scanning electron microscopy analysis of the edges of stone tools, where you see the distinctive use-ware that has been made from harvesting grass or processing plants in other ways. So there's a lot of diversity to the ways in which these first peoples lived their lives. Now, in Wisconsin, both mammoth and mastodon remains have been excavated, and there's some kind of interesting things about the Kenosha site. Nothing diagnostically Clovis or fulsome from the Kenosha sites, but we have really good radiocarbon dates for the finds from the Kenosha sites. And some of those radiocarbon dates, the ones on some of the mammoth remains, are older than Clovis. And some of those remains have what look like cut marks on them. So they were butchered, perhaps hunted and killed, but definitely butchered by people. And then, not too far away, mastodon are found. Now, these two species of elephants have different diets. And this is something I just think is super cool. So the mammoths live in plains environments, grassland. They are grazers who eat grass, while mastodons live in forested environments and eat leaves and twigs and thin branches. So the southwestern part of the state, just as everywhere else in the world, when the glaciers first begin to recede, there's permafrost, and then that's replaced by tundra vegetation. And then you get grasslands coming in, and then the grasslands get replaced by forests. And so in the southeastern part of the state, we have this wonderful sort of sequence of animals that is telling us about the way in which the vegetation was evolving and changing and in the wake of deglaciation. So I think it's just like super, super cool that it kind of works out that way. So to sort of think about bring our attention kind of back to the eastern United States and the things that we have learned from the archaeological work in the eastern United States, we learned about a wide range of other kinds of sites beyond the kill butchery sites that are so well represented in the West. One of the most visible of these sites, and here I'm just going to, excuse me, I'm going to focus on Wisconsin, these kinds of sites in Wisconsin, are the quarry sites, or stone quarries that are also workshops for reducing big chunks of stone down to sizes that could be portable and making stone tools. And these are found in a couple of places in Wisconsin in association with different lithic raw materials. These are just two of them. There are a few others in Wisconsin as well. But silver mound and Hixton silicified sandstone, I noticed that one of the points that you have on display out here is a Hickston silicified sandstone. It's an archaic or woodland, early woodland point. But that material was also very popular among the Paleo-Indians, the first peoples. And Marquette rhyolite, which is a coarse-grained stone. We find Clovis points and Folsom points made out of Hickston silicified sandstone in Wisconsin and in some other places around the Midwest. The Marquette rhyolite, we never find fluted points, as these are called. We never find Folsom or Clovis out of Marquette rhyolite. We find later Paleo-Indian tools made out of rhyolite. So it was a source that became of interest to people after they'd been here for perhaps 1,000 years. And they used other stone resources as well, but these are a couple that are spatially restricted and very distinctive and pretty readily recognized. In addition to quarry sites and workshops, of course, Paleo-Indian peoples were living on the landscape. They were exploring the landscape, exploring it very quickly after it was deglaciated, and looking for different kinds of resources, but also paying attention to how those resources were changing over time. And so across the entire state, there's a thin scatter of Paleo-Indian finds that reflect probably these small habitations where they lived for a few weeks at a time before they moved on to someplace else, continuing to explore resources. And most of these are scattered across the southern part of the state, but there are some in the northern part of the state. We don't have a really good example of this in Wisconsin, but in Ontario and in the Southwest, there are what are called lookout sites, sites that are situated on prominent landforms that overlook river valleys in particular that were likely to have been migratory pathways for animals like caribou, even mammoth and mastodon. So this is another site type that we know of mostly from excavations in the eastern United States. And then there's a type of site that's called an aggregation site. And this is something that theory about hunter-gatherers would tell us must exist, that there would be places where nomadic hunter-gatherer groups that were small would periodically gather in larger numbers to share information about this new landscape they're exploring, to share mates, to engage in certain rituals, to do a variety of different things. And these would be places that would be revisited, maybe not year after year, but every few years. And when people were there, they might stay a little bit longer. They might spend a month there or a little bit longer. And they would engage in a wide variety of activities while they were in these locations, whereas a short-term habitation site will only show a limited number of activities. A kill butchery site, it's all about the hunting, the killing, the butchering. Quarry sites, it's about making stone tools. So an aggregation site should look different than the other kinds of sites that we see, according to theory. And as it turns out, we have one, there may be more, there's one that we know of these probable aggregation sites in Wisconsin. And it's a site called Skari. It's located outside of Madison, between Lake Kagansa and Lake Wabisa, so on this chain of lakes that's part of the Yahara drainage. And this is a site that I had an opportunity to work at when I first came to Wisconsin in the early 2000s. And it was talked about as a Paleo-Indian site, but there were artifacts from just about every major archaeological culture in the state represented at the site. And so there wasn't a great deal of certainty if, was this really, what kind of site was this? Did it have Paleo-Indian materials? What was going on? So I was given an opportunity to run an excavation there. And my project came on the heels of a survey that had been done by the State Historical Society before I had moved to Wisconsin. And they had found archaeological materials scattered across about 37 acres. So this is a good-sized site with archaeological materials all over it. They had collected their materials in a very controlled manner. And so when we look at where the diagnostic Paleo-Indian materials came from, they were predominantly from the northern part of the site. And so when I had an opportunity to undertake excavations here, I had a couple of questions. There were Paleo-Indian materials here, and then Oneota materials over here. And so we did some excavations here and found out this is actually where everybody dumped their trash. And Oneota, being the most recent occupants of the site, their trash was on top. And so that was why it was so visible on the surface. And Paleo-Indian materials, as well as there were no Oneota materials found in surface collections in the area where the Paleo-Indian materials came from, but in our excavations we found late woodland and Oneota materials. And this is the excavation units we put in sort of the center of where these Paleo-Indian materials had been recovered. And amazingly, we found the base of a Folsom point in our first season of fieldwork, in actually the first couple of weeks. And I know friends who I've got friends who spent their entire careers studying Folsom and have never found a Folsom point. And I came to this project as somebody who worked on late prehistoric complex societies like Mississippian and Oneota. So this was pretty remarkable. And it was the first time that one of these had been found in an undisturbed context in Wisconsin. At the site, there had been other Folsom points that had been recovered from surface collections. So there were other hints of things going on that were Paleo-Indian there. But this allowed me to kind of then look at the entire surface collection as well as the materials that we excavated with a different eye. And in doing so, I found that there were a lot of other kinds of stone tools that are associated with Paleo-Indian and are uncommon in later archaeological traditions. One of these is a tool that's called a graver. It's distinctive for having a teeny tiny point, and it was used for engraving in bone and ivory, and for sometimes cutting bone and ivory in order to get thin slivers that could be used for making needles or other kinds of tools. And this is just a small sample of the numbers of these gravers that have been recovered from the Skari site. This looks like some, blob, and it's called most easily called a wedge. There's a fancy French name for it. But it's something that has had some flakes taken off of it, but it's got a battering on opposite ends. And these are things that were set into either heavy bone or wood to help split the wood or split the bone. And so they are battered. There's a certain battering pattern from the end that was in wood and a different battering pattern from the other end, which was being hit by stone tools. And these are common on Paleo-Indian sites. These are big. They're like the size of your hand, and they have kind of a fan shape. These are hide scraping tools. And later, hide scraping tools are smaller. This kind of large, hand-sized scraping tool is found on Paleo-Indian sites. And then they're called blades. They're just flakes of stone that are more than twice as long as they are wide. And there's a blade technology that develops about 2,000 years ago that is much more finely crafted than these. This blade technology is a little bit, the edges are not as parallel and even, and these are often seen on Paleo-Indian sites where we think they were set into bone handles, where there would be multiple blades that would be set into a bone handle to create a kind of rough-edged cutting tool. So when we look at this kind of complement of all of these different Paleo-Indian associated stone tools at the site, we see, gosh, there was a lot of different things that they were doing at this site. They were engraving, they were making wooden tools, they were woodworking, they were hide scraping, they were cleaning hides. And the Folsom points that we find at the Skari site are all really small. They are points that were used until there was almost nothing left to be used, and so they were retooling at the site. They were making new Folsom points to haft, and then they were throwing away the ones that they had used up. So a lot of different things are going on at this one site that make me think that this was probably an aggregation locality. Now, why this place and not some other place? That got me thinking about the distribution of Paleo-Indian sites across Wisconsin. And so I turned to the literature, and this was, I came to Wisconsin in 2000, and this was what was known in the literature at that time for the distribution of Paleo-Indian across the site. This is what had been published, this is what most people would reference. And so there were not that many fluted points. Dane County and Jefferson County had produced more than 5 each. But we're talking like, 8 or 10 at most. And all of these other counties produced 1, 2, 3, or 4, or none. So it really was, I looked at this and I was like, wow, this is sort of cool. Like Dane County, Jefferson County, this is the hot spot for Paleo-Indian in the site, or in the state. But there were so few that were reported that I was kind of skeptical that that was really all that was out there. So I turned my attention to the unpublished state site files, and I looked through those to find every report of a fluted point. And these are distinctive things. These are not something that someone's going to mistake for something else in this report. So they're going to be well reported. And this shows the distribution of fluted points in the unpublished literature across the state, as well as the published literature, which is just such a small number. And now you can see there's actually multiple places that have concentrations of these fluted points. It's not just Dane and Jefferson County. The total number that are represented on here is 471, and the numbers have gone up a little bit since this was in the mid-2000s. And they're faint, but there are fluted points, like a single fluted point from many of the counties in the northern part of the state. There aren't a lot of them. So let's sort of take a look at the factors that might contribute to this distribution pattern. So it's clearly not continuous, and it's not uniform. It really looks like there's more Paleo-Indian stuff in some parts of the state than in other parts, because there's more of these fluted points. One thing to look at is population density. So the more people that live in a part of a state, the more eyes might be looking at the ground. Not everybody walks around like an archaeologist looking at the ground all the time. I routinely find money. Everybody else I know just walks right by and I'm like, oh gosh, did you see that dollar? Or did you see the quarter on the ground? I'm like, what? So we're, but there are enough people out there that these things would be found. If they were evenly distributed across the state, you'd find more of them where more people were living. And most of the people, the population concentration in the state is really in the eastern half as well as kind of the central part of the state. And yet we've got things going on in the southwestern part of the state, large numbers of these fluted points without so many people living there. So to me, this suggests that there's an underlying pattern here that reflects Paleo-Indian land use practices. So let's explore some of those. I think first though, the other thing is institutional bias. The other thing to consider is where are the archaeologists? Because I hate to say it, but we often don't go too far away from where we live to look for artifacts and sites. And so you can see that there's a large number of fluted points reported near UW-Oshkosh, which has had a faculty member since the early 1980s who was really interested in Paleo-Indian. UW-Milwaukee had a long-term presence of work in Jefferson County around Aztalan. And they did surveys throughout the whole county. So that might contribute to the high numbers there. Of course, UW-Madison's in Dane County, and there's a lot going on in Dane County, and all of our we have a lot of students, and they get really keenly interested in archaeology, and then they go out and look, and they see things, and they report it. And MVAC, the Mississippi Valley Archaeology Center at UW-La Crosse, has spent a lot of time in Jackson County and Pierce County. We've also spent a lot of time in La Crosse County, which doesn't have a whole lot of reported Paleo-Indian sites. And then there's the southwestern part of the state, the driftless area, which doesn't have the kind of great institutional bias, although UW-Madison has done a lot of projects in this part of the state. They've just been focused primarily on the last 2,000 years, not on earlier times. And I was like, I still sort of think there's something going on behind, there's an underlying pattern here. So I looked at key resource distributions across the state. Preferred lithic sources. Marquette rhyolite, which doesn't get used until late Paleo-Indian times, comes from here, and there are no fluted points there. To me, that suggests it was a lithic source that hadn't been discovered yet, or hadn't been seen as of great value. Silver Mound and Hickston silicified sandstone in Jackson County, that's an area where a lot of fluted points have been found, and a lot of them are made out of Hickston. And Hickston stuff is found elsewhere as well. And then Cochrane Chert in Pierce County was another preferred lithic resource. These are high quality sources that people really like. So I was like, okay, it looks like some of this distribution pattern could possibly be related to lithic raw material. The next one that I looked at was glacial lakes and wetlands, because this was a rapidly changing landscape. And if we look at Dane County, the blue on this map that goes around the lakes, and this is, I think, just Lake Kagansa, but the blue shows what was lake at the end of the Pleistocene. So this was just one giant, the four lakes were one giant lake called Glacial Lake Yahara. And when we plot for Dane County the locations of the fluted point finds, they kind of ring the four lakes on the margins of what had been the lake 10,000 plus years ago. Jefferson County, almost all of Jefferson County was a glacial lake Scuppernong. It was a lake that drained probably a little bit earlier than the Glacial Lake Yahara, so it was kind of a swampy area that would have, and these wetlands might have attracted people, they certainly would have attracted animals. And then near Oshkosh, Glacial Lake Oshkosh, a lot of the fluted points up there are around the margins of Glacial Lake Oshkosh, which is kind of cool. And wetland resources are just really, they're so obviously important to ancient people just as they are today. And this just is sort of zooming in on where the Skari site was located within Glacial Lake Yahara, and it was on kind of a peninsula or island that connected two points. So it may have actually been a great avenue of migrating animals in the winter, but also offered narrow spaces through which fish would be swimming and might be easier to acquire. So, in conclusion, this work has shown that there are a lot more Paleo-Indian sites and fluted points represented in the state than you would gather from just reading the published literature. They are found across the state, but mostly in the southern half, which is likely related to the changing vegetation and landscapes as the state was deglaciated, because the northern half of the state was deglaciated much later than the southern half of the state. And so it didn't have as much in the way of plant and animal resources as the southern part of the state had. But there are fluted points there, and so it would appear that Paleo-Indian peoples were exploring lands as soon as they became vegetated, became tundra, or began to become grasslands. Certainly there's an institutional bias that seems to influence the pattern that we see in terms of the distribution of fluted points across the state, but there's an underlying pattern of association with different key resources that would have been important in the lives of ancient Paleo people. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't thank the students that work with me, because I can't do this kind of work without their assistance in the field as well as in the lab. And of course, funding agencies. This work has been funded by the State Historical Society, UW-Madison, and a Vilas Associates Award and a Vilas Life Cycle Professorship. So thank you very much. Any questions? Legoland in the Twin Cities. Yes.
I remember in old textbooks that this whole migration thing was often studied through blood-proof analysis. Maybe you want to
So the way in which it's mostly looked at today is through ancient DNA and through DNA analysis of modern blood samples. And most of these analyses involve relatively small sample sizes, and just about every analysis that gets published changes things a little bit. But the most recent publication supports that the origin of the ancestors of all Native Americans can be traced back to Northeast Asia, somewhere in Siberia, kind of central Siberia, and that there were likely at least 3 separate waves of migrants that had enough time to sort of change genetically, so couple thousand years passed between the waves of migration. And stay tuned, because 25 years ago, when this, the ancient DNA technique was first kind of being developed, some of the early studies on ancient DNA found a haplogroup that was found among Scandinavian people. And so some of these early studies suggested that Scandinavians had made it into the Americas very early, much earlier than people had thought. And of course, everybody who lived in Minnesota was like, yes, we've been waiting for you to say that. But then as more sample sizes were processed, they found that actually this was a haplogroup that has even greater antiquity that can be traced back to Central Asia. It just happens to be shared by people of Scandinavian descent as well as people of Native American descent.
Nothing from Africa?
Nothing that you would tie from Africa. I mean, eventually you go back far enough, yes. But no.
Not direct over.
Not direct over, no. And not direct over from Europe, and not from Polynesia, it looks like. That one's kind of complicated because of the way the Polynesian islands were settled.
Tiki.
Yeah, so the whole Polynesian question is that people are just starting to look at that, and it's kind of complicated. So I saw many arguments. Yes?
Last 5 or 6 years, more attention has been given to artifacts found on the East Coast that might suggest a greater antiquity coming from the East.
Mm-hmm.
What do you have to say about that?
So the argument there is that there's a technological similarity between Clovis, which dates back to some 12,000 years ago, and Paleolithic tools that date back 40,000 years in Europe. So there's a huge time gap there, number one. There's nothing in Europe that looks like Clovis. They're just saying that the ways in which the tools were made used similar technologies. And so the kind of fundamental assumption that underlies that idea is that an innovation, a technological innovation, can happen only once and then spread. Technological innovations don't happen in multiple places at different times. And I don't believe that. I think technological innovations can happen. The same thing can be innovated in 2 different places, 3 different places, 4 different places. So I don't have a sort of strong belief in that. The other thing that is, there's another thing that's that's challenging about, or another sort of piece of evidence that's missing, and that is that the technology that is in Europe that these scholars argue would be influencing Clovis was tightly associated with a whole corpus of art in terms of rock art, carvings, elaborate carvings in ivory, and we don't find any of that dates back to more than a few thousand years in the Americas. So there's that sort of disconnect. And then we don't have any European stone here. So these first peoples, you'd think they would be they might have brought some of that great high quality stone material they had with them, and we don't see that here. So it's all these different pieces that make me kind of skeptical about that European connection. And then the genetics all point to Asia. The language analysis, linguistic analysis of different languages represented among Native Americans throughout the Americas all tie back to Asia. So there's, other than that runestone in Minnesota, there's not as much to really kind of connect it to Europe.
Well, as you suggested before, some of these theories are driven by people who have been published and who are important. I know that the fellows pushing that theory are just that.
Oh yeah, they are. They're very prominent people, but they don't have a lot of others that are kind of saying, yeah, absolutely. There's, David Meltzer is a very prominent scholar at Southern Methodist University who spent his entire career working on Paleo-Indian stuff, and he's very skeptical of the European origin story. Yeah.
So we're looking at densities kind of by county, maybe by township. I wasn't quite clear on what the
county.
By county. How does the density of those look when you go down to, there was one site in Dane County that produced half those points as opposed to they were scattered across a wider area within a county?
So in Dane County, the largest number of points, and there's more, I can't remember the exact numbers, but there's more than 40 from Dane County, and they are distributed among over a dozen sites. There is one site in Vernon County, actually, I think, that was reported to have yielded 40. And that's the largest number from any single site reported anywhere in the state. I think it might have been 20, I can't remember, but it was a compared to all of the other sites in the state, it was a very large number.
The reason I asked that question is I just knowing nothing about archaeology or the methods or how this stuff even happens, we stumble across an area that blew me away. But anyway, how do you account for the fact that just somebody luckily found one and then you concentrate on that particular site and find a whole bunch more, but have no idea what else is around you? How does that get
So the vast majority, really with the exception of the one point that we found on my project, and about 3 or 4 that were found in just the last 6 years in Door County. All of the others come from surface collections and multiple sites, or unless there's only one site in the county. But all of these counties have had a lot of survey done on them, and part of the reason that we're not. We probably wouldn't expect to find large numbers of them in one location is the nature of Paleo-Indian subsistence settlement practices, that they are nomadic people. They're exploring a recently deglaciated landscape that's still changing, and so they're not necessarily returning to the same place every year unless it's an aggregation site. And I don't think there is another Paleo-Indian site that has been identified in Wisconsin that either through surface collection or excavation has produced the diversity of tools that come from the Skari site. And even there, the fluted points are a very small percentage of the assemblage. It's a lot of these other tools are much more abundant.
The research that was done as part of the Lafarge Dam project here in the Kickapoo Valley by the Historical Society starting in around 1960 and went on for decades. And like the findings of the Hanson Rock petroglyph and some of these other things, did they all play into this?
They represent descendants of these first peoples. So these are these first peoples who came into Wisconsin. Their descendants walk among us today, and their descendants were responsible for all of the rest of the archaeological record that we have in Wisconsin. These were, as I mentioned, they were very nomadic people. People moved, and so they. When we kind of step back and we look at the North American continent as a whole, Clovis fluted points are found across pretty much the entire continent south of the glacial ice sheets. By the next major archaeological tradition is the Archaic, and stone tools are being made in different styles. And by that point, we start to see stylistic differences between the southeastern United States, the Ridge and Valley province through the Appalachians, the Ohio Valley, the Midwest, the Southwest, the Northwest. So just thinking about how that kind of regional diversity and style arises, we would typically conclude that that means that people are not moving over so much area, and they're settling down into smaller areas, and they're sharing within those smaller areas the sort of ideals of what a stone tool should look like. And that's where you start to see these differences, because people are in this area interacting more regularly with one another and less regularly with people who live 200 kilometers away. There might be some connections, but they're not as frequent, and they're not as interested in emulating one another's style. And as we continue into the next tradition, the woodland tradition, we see that those areas get even smaller still. So there still is movement and migration, but most people might spend their entire lives within a couple 100 kilometer radius. Even if they were moving on a seasonal basis, they might not move over great distances. Whereas with Paleo-Indian, there we're seeing that there's evidence of movement over 500 kilometers. And we infer that from very distinctive stone tool raw material types, where they originated from, when there's a fixed quarry spot, to where they were found. And when we get into later time periods, we don't see that same great distance. So there's some really, and I think psychologically, the first peoples that came into Americas must have been such brave people, because it would have been like exploring the moon. Except that, they didn't necessarily know that they were moving into a completely different continent, but they were moving into lands that no people had explored before them. And that's just, I think, so amazing.
Oh, you've got them coming in the three directions into this continent, yet on one of your slides it shows that it seemed that most of the artifacts really are more on the east coast.
So that comes back to...
Did they not want to stay on the west coast?
It comes back to multiple things. One, population density.
Oh, people finding.
Yes, many more people live in the eastern United States than live in the western United States. Geomorphology, or the geomorphological history of landscapes. A lot more of the Paleo-Indian sites in the west are deeply buried, and most of the ones in the east are on the surface. So they have a greater visibility for the more people that live there. And then in terms of resources, in the west, water and plant resources, and therefore also animal resources, are distributed in a more patchy fashion. And in the east, it's you've got rivers everywhere, lakes, you've got a much greater microecological diversity going on in the eastern United States. So it's kind of all of these different things that impact that difference. And people have been talking about that since these maps that show the distribution of Clovis on a continental scale, because that's, it's actually one line of support that has been used to support the European origin, is because they're all in the eastern United States, but you have to also think about the sampling of, how are these things being discovered, and what's the likelihood that they're exposed on the ground surface as opposed to buried. Yeah.
I had a comment and a question.
Yes.
You mentioned back to Vernon County. It's my understanding that was a convergence there in southwestern Vernon County of some of the major trails that led through the state. And there's evidence they joined other states too. Converged right there in Vernon County.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so, that would bring more people to that area. Yeah.
And my question was, is there an update on the findings at Gottschall Rock Shelter?
So there haven't really been any new publications since the little book that came out, and there has not been any new field work there in quite some time. So,
Like Beloit or Madison?
Madison hasn't done any work there.
And why is that?
There's only one North American archaeologist at UW-Madison, that's me. And I've got projects in Illinois at Cahokia, in Western Kentucky, and at the Scary site, and at Aztalan in Wisconsin. And so I kind of am, it just hasn't, I've got enough going on, it has not attracted me with all the other things. Most of my other research is related to Mississippian and to understanding the emergence of socio-political complexity and the relationship between complex agrarian societies and climate change. So, completely different. This was such a fun project for me when I first came here, because it was very weird, because I had certainly been exposed to the literature on hunter-gatherers and Paleo-Indian, but I had a steep learning curve with this at the same time as I was doing projects in Kentucky and in Illinois. And I didn't start working at Aztalan until fairly recently.
Is Gottschall the paleo?
Gottschall is a late woodland. I don't know that it has any deposits that go back as deep as paleo, but most of what's been published related to Gottschall is late woodland, dating to 1,000 years ago.
So how about just a couple more, and then we'll kind of wrap up.
Okay. Samantha.
Have you noticed any patterns between glaciated versus unglaciated areas?
Not really, except that the more recently deglaciated parts of the state have far fewer fluted points. So that's kind of like the northeast and somewhat of the northern part. Where we do see a really interesting pattern between glaciated and unglaciated parts of the site is in the distribution of copper tools, which were not manufactured until several thousand years after Paleo-Indian. They're associated with sort of Middle Archaic, Late Archaic, probably some would be Early Archaic in age. I think some of the oldest copper tools in Wisconsin date back about 8,000 years. And those are found predominantly in the glaciated part of the state and far less abundant in the non-glaciated part of the state. And that is probably in part because when the glaciers came across the Keweenaw Peninsula, copper was exposed on the surface, and the glaciers picked up copper, and they carried the copper forward with them. And then as the glaciers receded, the rock, the sand, and the copper that they had carried within them fell out. And so the eastern half of the state, when native peoples came into Wisconsin, was probably littered with nodules of copper. And then it's clear that they also very quickly figured out that there were fixed sources in the Keweenaw and on Isle Royal, and began to mine copper. So that's a great question, sort of thinking about the glaciated, unglaciated. There is, yeah, it's a great question.
Okay, so I get the last two.
Okay, you get the last two. Yes,
Is your site protected near Lake Taganza?
yes.
Okay, good. It's in public protection.
It's in public protection, it's publicly owned.
Second, how does UW-Madison only have one?
We have 5 archaeologists, but only one of them works in North America. Wow. And it has to do with the department's longstanding commitment to trying to cover the globe with a relatively small number of faculty. So for the most part, there's only one person who works in any part of the world.
That's amazing. Well, we are very thankful that we get When we put these grants together, we always talk about the Wisconsin idea, that this is the Wisconsin idea.
This is wonderful.
When we come up and get somebody out here to talk and to a full room, so we appreciate that.